Right. All right. So America spent the last century chasing a fantasy version of China that never existed. And this month, Congress quietly put the biggest China hawk in Washington on the board of the CIA favorite regime change slush fund. Are we sleepwalking into World War III over the exact same mirage that gave us Korea and Vietnam? Here to break it all down, Jeremy Kuzmarov of Covert Action magazine and Pacific historian James Bradley, author of The China Mirage, and we're going to discuss this, right?
And the Vietnamese said, I was 16 years old. I didn't know anything about democracy, communism. I just saw the Americans shoot my sister to death. That's all I had to know.
Here we are.
Here we are. So, what first opened your eyes to the gap between the official US narrative on China and the historical reality, Jeremy?
Me? Well, I mean, I'm a historian, so I did study a bit of Chinese history and looking at the arc of history and the impetus behind the Chinese, communist revolution, the 19th century, neocolonialism of Great Britain, and the kind of program that the Maoists were advancing, land reform and how they had helped mobilize the population against Japan. But yeah, I think the United States, unfortunately, the history is not well understood by the majority of the population then as now. And it's just, the world is viewed in kind of black and white terms, so communist evil, democracy good, America's on the side of the angels. So I think there was a misperception of the communist revolution from the outset, unwillingness to look at it from the Chinese point of view and why that movement gained support. And I think there were some figures in the State Department who had a good understanding, like Owen Lattimore and other figures who were purged in the McCarthy era. And so I think there was a top-down effort to kind of maybe dumb down the public discourse and suppress the reality. And it led, as you point out, to a disastrous foreign policy. And we seem to be embarking on the same, course today. The same kind of demonized rhetoric prevails. There's no nuance, and China's, genocidal, and that's the kind of rhetoric that leads to world wars.
And can I chime in? I think James wrote about it in the Imperial Cruise that it's the white man's job to spread democracy, right? And so, James, what got you interested in looking into this history?
Well, I went to school in Japan and at college, so that's what got me into Asia. But I'll give you one little story here that I find very interesting. So Japan drops the bombs on Pearl Harbor, right? Immediately after Pearl Harbor, there's a poll. Who is America's favorite ally worldwide? And by far, it's China. Now think about it. In Wisconsin, there's Swedes. In St. Louis, there's Italians. In New Orleans, there's French people. This is 1941. For 60 years, it had been illegal for Chinese to come to the United States. So these Swedes and Bohunks and Polacks and frogs and English people and Krauts, all these different Americans, they were Eurocentric and they didn't live next to a Chinese because the Chinese weren't allowed in the country. Everything about Europe, we knew the difference between northern France and southern France and the border with Belgium, and we didn't know anything about China. But China was our favorite ally. How could that be possible? It was because of all this propaganda that China wanted to be just like us. Pearl Buck's book, The Good Earth, was the only book in the 20th century that was #1 for 2 years in a row. #1 for 2 years in a row. When they made the movie, there were lines around the block to get into the Good Earth to see the Chinese who wanted to be just like us. But none of the actors or actresses were Chinese because it was illegal to have Chinese kiss on screen. So we had this image of China as wanting to be just like us. And that's when we like China. When China wants to be just like America, we love China. But when China wants to be just like China, we don't like that.
Yeah, and in one sentence, and your other book, China Mirage, in one sentence, what was the core of China Mirage that led FDR and the American public in the 1930s and 1940s?
The China Mirage is that those Chinese, if you just cut the head off of President Xi, the communist ruling party, 100 years ago, the Empress, if you just get rid of those rulers in Beijing, the Chinese people want to be just like us. They want to have potluck suppers in the basement of their churches, and they want to be Democrats, just like Americans. But it's just their leadership. We just got to do some regime change there. And the Chinese want to be just like us Americans. That's the China Mirage.
And how did the China lobby, such as the missionaries, Sohn family, Henry Luce, United China Relief, create this fantasy version of Chiang Kai-shek that still echoes today?
That's the thing, is that if you look at the world, the Atlantic is this wide. And we were Eurocentric, and we could go across the Atlantic. My grandparents came from Holland. The Pacific, that's the largest physical barrier in the world. Chinese use chopsticks, and they got those funny letters, and we can't understand. So China's a very distant culture from America. But there was a bridge built by missionaries and rich opium dealers like Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandfather, Warren Delano, was the American opium king of China. And the bridge that they built, they came back and said to the Americans who knew nothing about China, China wants to be just like us. If we just get rid of that emperor, if you just get rid of that President Xi, if you just clean off that top, China wants to be just like us Americans. And it happened in the Vietnam War too. There's a general in what's the movie? Full Metal Jacket, Stanley Kubrick. And he says, I want you to know that inside of every gook, there's an American who wants to get out. And that's the China or the Vietnam Mirage, is that if we can just straighten some things out, these Asians want to be just like us. And we continue to think that way. And again, we love China when they want to be just like us. When China wants to be China, we don't like China.
Interesting. And Jeremy, which modern institution or figures feel like a direct descendant of this China lobby to you?
I think the article that I did focused on the National Endowment for Democracy, and they champion, Chinese dissidents, those who, want to develop more of a capitalist system, more of American political structure within China, reorient, China's economy more in a way that would serve the interests and needs of the American economy and not China's own interests. So those are the kind of people that the NED cultivates and celebrates, and they play up the human rights abuses, and promote a very demonized view of the Chinese Communist government, which, as James and I have discussed before, and he's more of an expert than me, but this is a government that has a huge amount of credibility and legitimacy among its own people. It has the mandate to rule because China has overcome the century of humiliation and a prosperous society. That government has uplifted millions and millions of people out of poverty, and it's initiating development projects all around the world, and it has tremendous, infrastructure that's been developed. I mean, if you look at China, the quality of life is eclipsing the United States, and that's why we may be seeing this kind of bitter xenophobia, because it's really a matter of jealousy that not only has China not become like America, but on its own terms, its economy has done much better than America, and it's providing much better quality of life for its people now. So there's a reaction to that.
Yeah, and in your article, you mentioned that the NED just put the chair of the House Select Committee on the CCP on its board. And so, what does this appointment tell us about who is steering U.S. China policy right now? And what do you think about that? Can you talk about that?
Well, it seems to be a return to the dark ages of the McCarthy era, with a rampant xenophobia. I mean, this committee is using similar tactics of McCarthy era, kind of red baiting, false accusations. I mean, this guy, Molinar, the chair of this committee, is attacking university presidents that they're supposedly allowing Chinese spies on the campus. And he's providing no evidence of this, and he's pushing for the cutting of cultural exchanges. And he championed this case of these University of Michigan scientists. I think they're graduate students in science, and he claimed that there was this huge plot that was foiled, that they were going to poison the crops. And meanwhile, they were trying to further their own research. They were bringing some innocuous plants, and I think they didn't file exactly the right customs forms, and it was really to further their own research. And it was a plant that's widely available already. There's no evidence of any nefarious intent there, but it's used just to demonize, make people believe that there's some kind of Chinese communist plot to infiltrate American university campuses. And this is, right out of the John Birch Society. That was what James, I think, knows about, an extreme group, right-wing group in the Cold War era that actually I found out recently was financed in part by Fred Trump. Donald Trump's father was one of the financiers, and they promoted this idea of the threat from within, that the communists were infiltrating all institutions, the educational institutions and government. And it would accuse people like Dwight Eisenhower and like Vietnam hawks like Walt Rostow being secret communist agents. And that's, yeah, we're hearing this kind of paranoid worldview. And I mean, they're alleging that Chinese are taking over all the farmland in America. And I mean, what proof of that do they have? I've seen that in Oklahoma in the ads for the governor on the television. This guy is saying, oh, we have to stop the Chinese from taking over our farmland. And, I barely see any Chinese around anywhere. So, let alone
It's actually
owning.
very fascinating. In Florida, I heard from my intern that she goes to a university in Florida and she's no longer allowed to use WeChat on campus.
Yeah, so they're really taking this to extreme, and it's leading to some ugly, the revitalization of some ugly attitudes. And it's building support for a warlike foreign policy. And I mean, the U.S. is now encircling China with military bases. It's ramping up. Obama started with the Asia pivot to reorient a lot of U.S. troops and build up the base infrastructure in Southeast Asia. And each president since has expanded that. And they've really beat Taiwan is heavily armed. They call it a porcupine. They think it's cute. And this, fool who writes for the New York Times, they worship him on a lot of college campuses. Thomas L. Friedman, thought this was such a cute analogy. Oh, it's a porcupine, Taiwan. But really, they're heavily arming Taiwan to the teeth with the potential for a hot war breaking out there. So there's nothing really cute or funny about that. So as we've seen from real life conflicts in Ukraine or elsewhere, caused the loss of millions of lives now. And yeah, they're building up the base networks in the Pacific Islands. They're, investing a huge amount of money to rebuild World War II era bases in Pacific Islands, which could serve as a launching pad. They've expanded the U.S. military presence in the Philippines. There's a huge amount of money, billions of dollars. And at a time that America is really falling apart, if you travel in American cities, it's never been worse. You see armies of homeless people. There's just a breakdown in public services are not functioning. The teachers are as poorly paid as ever. There were protests in my state. Teachers are miserably paid and they have huge debt. And I did an article for a local paper, interviewed them, and they were showing me also, like around the state, these were teachers from around my state, images in their classroom. They're mold and there are not enough chairs for students. like high school teachers are telling they're trying to retain students, their job, prevent the students from dropping out, and yet there's not enough chairs in their classroom. And they're also in heavy debt. These are people who've pursued a lot of different degrees, and they have huge debt, and they don't make nearly enough even to survive. Most have to have two jobs, so it's a terrible situation, and yet they're spending billions and billions on this Pacific Deterrence Initiative to rebuild these bases. And for what? I mean, Xi proposed a win-win strategy. There's no China threat. I mean, China, firstly, is not a militaristic country. I mean, it's projecting its power more through its economy and so-called soft power. And it advocated a win-win strategy with the United States, which would serve their really great potential. With China's economic growth can really be used to benefit the American economy in different ways. China doesn't have to be seen as an adversary. So this militaristic policy makes no sense, and it's leading to a potential war that the U.S. in this case cannot win. We're not back in the Cold War. China, had been underdeveloped for a century, and it took them decades, but now they're a very strong power with advanced technology and military technology. So this is not really a war the United States can even win, that they're preparing for and investing huge resources while the country is falling apart and its services are declining. So I
Yeah,
don't
I
know why
call
there's not more opposition among the U.S. public.
on my ex account, I call the United States a fourth world country because now we're actually below third world country kind of services. And I agree. Why are we spending tax dollars on that kind of on the military instead of doing our everyday citizen a favor? And the Select Committee regularly accuses China of genocide, fentanyl warfare, IP theft, and etc. Which of these claims hold up under the scrutiny, and which looks like an updated version of 1940s and 1950s propaganda?
Well, I think none of them. It's just a bunch of hot air, and the term McCarthyism is used widely in the English language to connote false accusations, unjust accusations against people, because McCarthy never had any proof for the people he accused, including Owen Lattimore, who I think was a very smart person who had an understanding of Chinese reality and was trying to explain it. And that could have avoided the disaster of Korea and Vietnam if people had listened to him and some others like him. But he was accused falsely of being a communist spy when he was a distinguished scholar of of China and Mongolia, and a learned man, and the kind of person you want in government who can actually explain the political dynamic in that country and region and history, so people can understand it and develop a sound policy. So anyway, yeah, I mean, like the fentanyl. Well, first, I think my study of the drug war, that they exaggerate. It's a strategy in general, or they exaggerate the threat of drugs, and also what underlie. They don't address the socioeconomic problem and breakdown that leads to rising drug use. And in this case, they don't. It's back to the yellow peril. They're blaming China when, I mean, it's a problem that results from some of the phenomena we're just describing: the breakdown in public services, the lack of employment opportunities for young people, lack of good education. The despair leads people to take drugs more and more, and then you're going to blame China, and they claim that China manufactures some of the chemicals. But I mean, the Chinese government has pushed back and asked for proof, which they're not providing any concrete proof. And it's the same. They're blaming Venezuela for drug trafficking when there's no proof of that either. And yet they released a major drug trafficker, Juan Orlando Hernandez, the Honduran president. They pardoned him. He was documented to be very much involved in the drug trade and the Mexican cartel. And what do? They pardon him. So, I mean, this is ridiculous. And I think almost all the charges are false. I mean, the genocide, they're claiming a genocide. I mean, the genocide, we know that's happening in our lifetime with the Israelis in Gaza, and it was funded by the U.S. government. Democrats and Republicans. Where the proof China committed genocide? In fact, there was some tribunals that were held by very biased xenophobic bodies, and I reviewed some of the transcript because I was trying to find out myself what is going on in Xinjiang, and I'm not an expert, but based on so they had these tribunals, and one was like British government foreign ministry, and so I was just reading the transcript, and the first guy who testified was an expert and said explicitly China did not opt for genocide or violent repression. They wanted to re-educate. They were dealing with a terrorist problem. And he stated explicitly in that tribunal, which was supposed to be an indictment of the Chinese government policy, that's like the first thing he said, is that they didn't opt for the violent route, that they and you can debate these re-education facility, but clearly that's not genocide. I mean, the Chinese claim it's job training and trying to integrate them better in Chinese society. And maybe there is some backlash or ground for criticism, but clearly it's not genocide. These tribunals make that clear. It's just we live in a twilight zone. I mean, they're
Yeah,
making
I think
allegations
every
of no proof.
accusation is really projection, really. And James, how does that really link to this China Mirage that you were writing about? And today, how the U.S. is turning Taiwan into an anti-PRC platform.
Well, the Vietnam War was about America said there's two Vietnams, and we have to fight for the freedom of one Vietnam against the other Vietnam. And the Vietnamese saw one Vietnam. So America wanted two Vietnams. Vietnam said there's one. Turns out there's one Vietnam. So it's the same thing right now. America is saying to its people, there's two Chinas. And that's what I had to learn in history class, that this little tiny rock out in the Pacific, that's a legitimate China, and China thinks there's one China, and Taiwan is a province. And 100 years from now, 200 years from now, we're going to see that there's one China. And we're going to learn about these crazy Americans that wanted to go to war over two Chinas. So we're just, it's not a legitimate argument, but it's profitable. Vietnam War was a tragedy, but I went to Vietnam and I realized it was a profit center. So everybody knows Dwight Eisenhower's military industrial speech, 1961, but they don't look at his first speech of his presidency. He gave a cross of iron speech. He said, America is being crucified on a cross of iron. This military, he didn't say military industrial complex, but he gave a great speech where he said, the production of a jet fighter, that is at the cost of building 4 or 5 American schools. So what Jeremy's talking about, there's no chairs in these classrooms. The teachers don't have facilities. Yeah, but if I'm an account executive for Lockheed, I don't care, because I just bought a new vacation house and my kids are going to Stanford, and I've got a big McMansion outside of Washington, and I wear $2,000 Armani suits, and I go lobby the Pentagon, and we're making record profits. And from see, the public looks at these as mistakes. Vietnam was a mistake. We didn't learn anything in Afghanistan. No, we learned a tremendous amount. Bell Helicopter was almost broke until their friend President Johnson said, Tonkin Gulf, we got to go to war. Bell Helicopter stock went up 400% within 2 months. So we have learned a lot. The Afghani war lasted 20 years. Let's go. If you're in the bed, if you're in the bowels of the military industrial complex, where is the failure? There's been no failure in all these preparations for war. War with China. Oh my God. Afghanistan, it's just IUDs on the road. China I mean, this is outer space. We need a space force. We need Navy. We need, we need electronics and science like you can't believe to go to war with China. Let's go to war with China and make money. So that's what's driving it. Don David Shoup of the U.S. Marine Corps, he retired when LBJ went into Vietnam. And he said in many speeches, civilians do not want to believe the motivations of the military to go to war. They often want to go to war for their pensions. And let me tell you this, he said to the public, you cannot be a military hero unless you have a.
Wow. Yeah, and I learned from your book that it's not the president who's making all the calls. It's all these people that he's going to benefit for who are going to go to war. And Jeremy, who else is going to benefit financially and politically from framing Taiwan as the next Ukraine or the next Israel?
Well, you also have to look at the Wall Street firms that a lot of them are the ones who invest and own the major defense contractors, and they're the BlackRocks, the Vanguard, the Blackstone Group, or some of them. And if you look at OpenSecrets.com, a lot of the politicians get a lot of them. You see a lot of the money from the Lockheed Martin, and you also see those names come up a lot too. Although they hide it in super PACs, but and then also you find that a lot of the appointees have connection to these Wall Street companies. The top positions are connected with these Wall Street companies, and so that's who benefits, not the
If
public, as we've been describing.
sorry to interrupt, I was at a Washington gig and I met the Attorney General of the United States. I'm standing next to him and he's dressed very well. And I'm thinking, what does he make? Like $175,000. And, he's just dressed very well. And then he says, I'd like you to meet my wife, James. She gives me her card. She's Vice President of Public Relations for Lockheed. It's
There's no
Joe Biden.
conflict of interest.
It's the Joe Biden, Hunter Biden thing. You don't do it directly. But my wife,
Right.
I went and met an ex-senator. I had to interview him, and he had a reputation as kind of anti-war, peaceful guy. And then his wife had a different name. So like my name, I'm Senator Bradley, and then my wife's name is Joan George or something, okay? And then I looked her up. Oh my God, she had been on every board of directors of every military industrial, contractor in the world for the past 30 years. So you don't have to do it directly, but the son or the daughter, the Pelosi's, and then it is like, I don't have any Lockheed stock. I have my money in Vanguard. Well, Vanguard own, let's see, Lockheed, and you know what I mean? I have anti-war friends who have their money with Vanguard, all these military industrial contractors without admitting it because it's a step away. And that is what's driving our economy. If I could say something else, I think if you took American conditions and moved them to China, the school kids don't have books, the girls are getting jumped on at night in cities, there's homeless all over the place, poop on the streets. If you moved American conditions to China, I think the Chinese government would be overthrown within a couple months. I don't
Oh,
think the
yeah.
Chinese I don't think the Chinese would put up with that. And a guy told me, he said, in America, the legitimacy comes from the vote. So you vote for the president, and then he starts doing what? We're going to war with Venezuela. We're giving money to Ukraine. We're bombing Palestine. And you have no control, day-to-day control. He said in China, legitimacy comes from what they do every day. He said in China, you couldn't get away with the government behaving like that because legitimacy doesn't come out of a once every 4-year vote. It comes out of, hey, did you remove my snow? Hey, is this street safe? China is looking for its government to actually perform for the people, and America has gone brain dead about demanding performance from our government.
Yeah, it's crazy because the same people who should be questioning the mainstream media, like, I think both sides want to go to war because of some propaganda in the media, framing all kinds of things. And what do you say to people, to these critics who want to go to war with China?
Jeremy, can I ask you a question? Can I butt in just to get on Jenny's question?
Sure.
Number one, Jeremy, do you think there's two sides? And number two, do you think there's an American media? I mean, after reading your article, I was thinking there's no American media. To get on the government channels, there's one media, it's the CIA media, and two sides. I mean, I got told by someone in the representative in the House of Representatives, he said to me, you know, James, I think if we thought it was possible, 100% of the House of Representatives would vote for China, war with China tomorrow. So my question is,
Yeah.
are there two sides? Is there a bad lean media? I mean, you know,
Well, and related to a point you were making about the mistake, was this a mistake? As you were pointing out, it was not a mistake. It was part of a profit-driven policy and imperialistic policy. And I think what they learned from Vietnam, because the media was somewhat more open in that time. I mean, you had, and perhaps because the war got so out of control, you had a lot of good critical reporting. The Seymour Hersh, even Halberstam reporting was pretty critical. Some of it. And there was just a lot of article, and that contributed to the growth of the anti-war movement. There was kind of a somewhat of an open space, and for a time there were people like Noam Chomsky and Peter Dale Scott who had access to journal like New York Review of Books that were very widely read. So I think that's when they learn. I mean, I think they learn to avert an anti-war movement. That was their goal, was to continue these kind of imperialistic and profit-driven policies without arousing any, reigniting the Vietnam era anti-war movement. So there are numerous ways they were able to pull that off. I mean, one is censorship of the media. One is also relying more on covert operations, drones, less manpower, because if there was a draft, then you might have more dissent, because people would really have to look into the situation. If they're going to risk their lives or somebody in their family, or they start friends, like when Vietnam, when friends start coming back in body bags, or siblings, or their life might be on the line, or somebody, their family, then they're going to really scrutinize what's going on, start to do that. But, now, so, they've been able to get away with these wars without reviving the draft, because they rely on proxies, drones, high technology, and also censorship. And they become the media is there's no open space. So, yeah, and to answer your question, no, there is no open media. There's no open space. Look at the career of Seymour Hersh. He once had access to, and he's a very gifted reporter who gets always gets the scoops. He's got the best sources, and he's been doing this for years. And why all of a sudden they cut him off, around I think around 20, when Obama came in, because he was equal in criticizing any administration, and exposing the corruption and deceit, whether Democrat or Republican. So once Obama came in, with Bush, I think there was still, because a lot of the country turned against Bush, so there was still maybe some space for critique and some independent reporting when Bush Cheney, because they went so far with the supporting torture, they alienated people. But then when Obama came in, and Obama, the CIA, he had this, my book shows his background in the CIA. He worked for the CIA after he graduated Columbia University. His grandfather was either the CIA or other military intelligence. His mother worked for the CIA or related agencies in Southeast Asia, Indonesia. So Obama is CIA, and I think that's when it really started. And that's when Hirsch, they cut him off. The New York Review, all these liberal journals cut him off. And when he exposed the Syrian chemical weapons hoax, he couldn't publish in any magazine in the United States. He could only publish it in Germany. And this is the greatest investigative reporter in probably in American history, along with figures like Upton Sinclair and Ida Tarbell. So if he can't get published, nobody can. I mean, and yeah, we see that there was a study, the New York Times op-ed page, even in Iraq, they had like a study found that they had, I think, for every 100 op-eds, like 99 were pro-war. And the one they had for some time, he's no longer there. There was one columnist who was writing something critical about the Iraq War. His name was Bob Herbert. And he's an African American, and he was focusing more on domestic aspects. There was nobody who was actually, critiquing U.S. foreign policy and its effects internationally. And that's a supposed liberal publication.
And it's crazy too, because during like the Ukraine war, the New York Times was reporting that Ukraine was winning. And I was thinking, like, in what world was Ukraine winning? I
Yeah.
think it was like in the middle of the war. And it was very obvious that Ukraine was losing. And like anyone could look at the situation and think that. But then New York Times had like this big page that was just saying, oh, yeah, Ukraine is winning for sure.
Now that I did a study that I published called "The Russians Are Coming Again," and we some of the chapters with John Marciano, and we analyzed the media coverage of Russia, and actually it's been universally bad going back 100 years. And actually, Walter Lippmann had a study of the New York Times coverage of the Russian Revolution in 1917. And he found that they reported the Bolshevik defeat about 300 times, when the Bolsheviks regime, lasted until 1991 and won the Russian Civil War, but the New York Times reported its defeat at least 300 times. So, I mean, it's no better today than, as you point out, they're doing the same. Yeah, they
And,
reporting.
James wrote about that in his book too for China Mirage, that Times Magazine was writing that Chiang Kai-shek is the Democrat leader of China and he was going to lead China. But even Joseph Stilwell, who was in China at the time, was like, there's no way. And he was also thinking about going to lead Mao's army with the Chiang Kai-shek's army, with the NRA, and have one China. But then, FDR, who was a drug king, whose grandpa was a drug king in China, was like, no, 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 I know what China is about, and Chiang Kai-shek is going to be the next Democratic leader of China. So yeah, it goes. I mean, I think fake news has been in this country for like a century at least.
And you can get away with it with China. That's my point, is that we don't know any Chinese. The Chinese have not been in this country for very long. So it's very easy for the missionaries to create this mirage. See, I've been to China. Let me tell you about China. You know, just ask people, have you been to China? When was the last time? Yeah, my uncle went on a cruise on the Yangtze. No, I'm talking about, people have been to London and Paris and gone to school in Rome and studied art, but that Pacific is wide. And we don't go as tourists to Asia like we do to Europe. And that's fine. But we throw our wars into Asia. We decide what to do with Asia in terms of controlling it. We're building out for war against China, but we don't know anything about it. So that's the problem I see. It's okay if Americans don't know how to use chopsticks, but it's not okay if the Americans who don't know anything about China are funding. I mean, when Jeremy said we're building bases, I was on Tinian. I was on the airfield where Enola Gay took off to bomb Hiroshima 10 years ago. That airfield, it was cracked cement and grass was coming up through the cement. Now we're spending billions of dollars. Man, we broke that cement up. We're paving that air. Tinian is all of a sudden has troops on it. We abandon it. We are putting blood banks out into the Pacific. We are refurbishing all these islands we used in World War II. Why? Because we are going to war with China, and there's nothing we're going to do to stop it.
So, okay, the future is pretty grim if most Americans only hear one side. What are the most effective ways, like books, independent media, to widen the Overton window on China policy?
Good luck.
Yeah.
No, I've tried. The China Mirage is about something invisible. It's about how Americans are thinking about something without knowing about it. And then I wrote the book and I realized, you know, I mean, unless you have physically been to a place, you really can't understand it. So China remains a concept in the American mind. And if it's only a concept, you can easily manipulate it. Bad China, bad China. We have to do something about it. And they are successfully manipulating our ideas about China.
Jeremy, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, well, James is right in what he's saying. It's very difficult. I mean, we can try our best. Education is really an antidote, I think, to these kind of imperialistic and ultimately foolhardy policies. So the any way we can educate people, get them to think more critically, get them to read James's books and other books on China, we can make some progress. And that's why I think they targeted the academy. James and I have discussed this, and I had an article about this, how the deep state, or the imperialist forces have really taken over the universities, which in the Vietnam era there was a lot of critical thinking that was, the war had really aroused people's consciousness, and that generation was very politicized and much more conscious politically and aware, than previous generations. There was a lot of critical thinking going on in higher education, and there was a whole school devoted to developing critical analysis of U.S. foreign policy, such as the Wisconsin School, James' home state. There's a group of historians from that university who became influential college professors, promoting more critical analysis and looking at these political economic variables that James was pointing out, the military-industrial complex, looking historically, critically at U.S. imperialism, and like with China, the open door policy and the commercial interest that drove U.S. support for Chiang Kai-shek, for instance. But that has died down. They really, the kind of CIA has taken over, and they've asserted, I think, more control. There's been a conservative backlash, and this kind of critical analysis you don't find very much anymore on the campuses. So I think that is by design. So I think that is important to reclaim higher education, and all levels of education, and promote cultural understanding and critical thinking. And that's why I think it's a crime what this House Committee on China is doing, is trying to cut off the cultural exchanges, because those are other programs that are very good. They bring students to visit China. They have engagement with Chinese students. They have all kinds of different programs. And that's how Americans can learn about the reality of China, and just try and better understand China on its own terms, and then ultimately push for better U.S. foreign policy that engages with China as it is, and doesn't foolishly try to go to war with it. So we need a movement to push back. I think alerting people of the evil of this select House Committee on China is a good step, and building political campaigns to expose and build public opposition to that, and to support cultural exchanges and open and free education.
Yeah, so it's interesting because now going to China is easier than ever. There's a 10 days visa free program. So as long as you go and then with a third destination, you don't even need a visa. So my husband went to China for the first time, and he's been kind of brainwashed by the US media. So he, in his mind, he was thinking, oh my God, the communist prison and blah, blah, blah. But then he went, and he had a great time, and he wanted to do a honeymoon in China. So it's just the public like perception in the US and like the reality are very different. So yeah, thank you so much. Do you guys have any other thing to say?
So your husband got married again? He wanted his honeymoon and his next marriage there? Is that what you're
No,
saying, Jenny?
I'm still happily married. But no, we went
Okay, I thought there was
we went
another.
to China before our marriage, and then after we got married, he was like, "Oh,
Oh,
we
okay.
should do our honeymoon in China. Why don't we go back to China? I had such a good time."
Okay, I got confused.
But
Okay, well, thank you guys.
Well,
Let's do this next one from China.
yeah.
yeah, we should.